My name is Jan Smenar. I'm professor here at Columbia. I also direct the Center on Global Economic Governance, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ned. Ned has done tremendous work at the Center on Capitalism and Society over the years, and this is indeed a terrific culmination of your effort to date. Our second session, deals with one of the most important topics relevant to the administration, namely trade. As you all know, already during the campaign, trade as an issue became forefront. Since then, President Trump has withdrawn from the transatlantic, trans-Pacific initiatives. We've had renegotiations on NAFTA, the tariff escalation that started and probably is continuing are major departures from what the US policy has been. So it's both a short run and a long run, potentially very disturbing long-run phenomenon. We have a terrific group of speakers. We'll start with Jeff Sachs, who is going to be coming in via satellite from somewhere, as I understand it. And then we'll have Robert Alibert, who is professor of international economics and finance, emeritus at the University of Chicago. And Barry Eichengreen, who is professor of economics and political science at the University of California at Berkeley. So, Jeff, welcome. Where are you?
I'm in Buenos Aires, and greetings to all of you. Can you see me?
Yes, indeed.
Yes. And hear me?
Yes, and we can hear
Yes,
you.
and we can. Excellent. And I sent some slides. I don't know whether they are up or not, or whether it would be more convenient for me to share the screen with you, whichever you would like.
Let's see if we can see that.
See if you can see that.
Well, how essential are they for understanding what you'll be saying?
Just a bit of help on organizing the talk. So what I will do is I'll share my screen, and I hope that that will suffice.
That should be okay.
Does that work?
Yes, that's very good.
All right, thank you very much. Well, thanks to Ned and Jan, and I'm delighted to be on a panel with Bob and Barry, although I can't greet them in person. I will talk about the Trump administration international or foreign economic policies more generally than trade, because I think that they are characteristic of a general set of issues and a general approach. The general approach is that the Trump administration favors U.S. unilateralism. This is America first in action. That's the point of departure, that rules should not bind the U.S., that if we are to negotiate, we should negotiate bilaterally, and it is a kind of divide and conquer strategy. Global negotiations are seen to be a trap. Too many unfriendly nations. Bilateral negotiations pit U.S. power against weaker counterparts. And I think that the third vision of Trump himself and the people that he's assembled around him are that we are looking for a transactional approach rather than a rule-based approach. This is the art of the deal in Trump's view, not the idea of creating a rule-based system. What is the underlying motivation for all of this? It is the decline of American power overall, which I will argue is mainly a reflection of the rise of economic and technological capacities around the world, most importantly, of course, China, but more generally, whereas Trump's assertion and the team around him assert that the U.S. has simply given up too much by being as powerful as it is and yet agreeing to play by rules which are not helpful for U.S. interests and rules which ultimately weaken U.S. power. But my view is that we have something, of course, deeper underway, which is the transition from American preeminence to America as being very powerful, no doubt, but powerful among several powerful national and regional actors. I would say that there are at least 6 components of the America First foreign economic agenda. So trade policy is only one of them. If we talk about objectives, I'll quickly say that they include increasing business investment, repatriation of industrial jobs, technological and military preeminence of the United States, U.S. primacy, a reduced trade deficit, the isolation of rogue countries or competitor countries, and the enhancement of U.S. Energy independence and energy leadership. What are the policy instruments that are being used for this? Again, going down the second column, the corporate tax cut is the centerpiece of the growth and business investment strategy. On repatriating jobs, it is tariff policy and rules of origin and other trade negotiation policies, such as the NAFTA renegotiations that aim to reestablish jobs in auto, steel, and other Midwest industries. In terms of technological and military preeminence, it is mainly to battle China through CFIUS, barriers to Chinese acquisition of technology, and the trade war with China, to tell China to back off its made in China 2025 policies, for example, at risk of losing the U.S. and broader markets. In terms of reducing the trade deficit, Trump's idea is that tariff and quota policies and specific sector negotiations will redress the U.S. Trade deficit. In terms of isolating other countries, it is basically to avoid or abandon U.S. treaties, or UN treaties, U.S. participation in UN treaties such as JCPOA vis-a-vis Iran, and the imposition of extraterritorial sanctions to impose the U.S. point of view, for example, on Iran or North Korea or Venezuela or other rogue countries as seen from the vantage point of the U.S. administration. And on U.S. energy policy, which is viewed as economically and structurally strategic, it is to try to break up the global climate action, and first and foremost by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. The next 2 columns really argue that none of these policies is likely to be very effective. There are direct impacts which might have some direct benefit from the point of view of the administration. The corporate tax cuts can induce capital inflows. The tariffs on steel and aluminum or new rules of origin on automobiles within NAFTA can boost U.S. output. CFIUS, barriers to China, and getting our allies to impose similar restrictions on Chinese acquisitions could slow down China's gain in cutting-edge semiconductor and other ICT technologies. The idea of using trade policy to reduce trade deficits, most of us macroeconomists view as sheer nonsense. The goal is subverted even in its direct impact by a stronger dollar. Trade is reduced, but the trade deficit is hardly cut because this is a saving investment imbalance more than anything else. In terms of isolating other countries, the first round effect is indeed to cut off trade with Iran, for example, or with North Korea. and so on. The U.S. International Energy regime of pulling out of the Paris Agreement has, I think, no doubt led to a small boost of output in coal and in fracking in the United States. But if one takes into account the indirect effects of all of these policies, they seem to me to be extremely weak and poorly targeted policies. Our last big corporate tax cut in the 1980s was followed by a round of corporate tax cuts in the rest of the world, which was part of a race to the bottom, and I have no doubt that the same will transpire now for negligible net gain of U.S. business investment in the U.S., though maybe a gain of wealth of large wealth holders, and that, of course, is equally part of the goal of these corporate tax cuts. But I doubt that there'll be much business investment spurred net-net. In terms of repatriating industrial jobs, the overall effect of increased tariffs and rules of origin and the like are likely to be net negative in job effects for all the reasons that trade economists have long emphasized. On the question of America's battle against Chinese technological preeminence or eminence, let's say, I think we are entering a new technology and arms race. I don't think it's one that the United States will win per se. This is not like the last days of the Soviet Union. We face formidable counterparts, and China invests and will invest at least as much as the United States in these technologies. They have a bigger internet base of users. They have their own tech giants that they have fostered. They're not going away. In terms of trade deficit, we'll have no impact on that, except probably a larger trade deficit because of a larger budget deficit. In terms of the question of isolating foreign countries through our extraterritorial sanctions, my view is that as Germany, France, and the UK have recently announced, and Juncker has recently announced on behalf of the European Commission, I think we're going to have alternatives to SWIFT so that we will not really have a single overwhelming dollar-based payment system or a single overwhelming U.S.-based payments clearance mechanism, but will diminish the role of the dollar by building the role of the euro, the renminbi, and with alternative payments mechanisms. So I believe that the U.S. extraterritorial sanctions, while they have some short-term bite, are really self-inflicted wounds rather than a long-term coherent policy. And on U.S. energy independence and the Paris Climate Agreement, surely Trump is contributing to reduced global coherence of climate policy, but on the whole, the climate action will continue, not sufficiently, but it will continue because the climate change impacts are growing and are very serious, as Hurricane Florence amply demonstrates in the United States. The maintained assumptions of the Trump administration are that the U.S. has the power to achieve favorable outcomes through bilateral negotiations. Second, that there are large gains to unilateralism and bilateralism, while the benefits of global rules are small. And third, and very importantly, geopolitically, the idea is the U.S. will maintain a coalition of European, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries that is U.S.-led, including, in the Trump-Bannon view, a revamped EU, India on side, Japan and Korea on side, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and others, and that they will follow the U.S. lead vis-a-vis China and rogue countries such as Iran, the DPRK, Venezuela, and other U.S. targets. I believe all of these assumptions are wrong. As I've said, I think the specific policy measures are unlikely to be successful in any of their objectives. I don't regard anything we are doing right now as structurally sound or as likely to succeed. It's creating a lot of consternation and noise, but I don't believe that these are well-designed instruments, and I don't believe in the end the U.S. is as frightening as the Trump administration thinks it is in terms of getting acquiescence. I believe, as a second point, that a rule-based global regime remains the focal point for global diplomacy. In other words, while there are the national leaders, President Xi or President Erdogan or President Putin or Prime Minister Modi, who are all strong national leaders, I don't really see the reversal of global rules as being the normative focal point. I think we have arrived, my guess, after more than 50 years of global rulemaking and more than 100 years of attempted global rulemaking, to a point where the notion of global rules as the heart of the international system is unlikely to be displaced by transactional, nationalist, balance of power tactics from a normative point of view. In other words, I believe we will continue to speak in goal-based terms and not therefore find an equilibrium in a transactional approach. A third assumption of mine, up for discussion, of course, is that I believe the U.S. will not be able to lead and maintain large and relatively stable coalitions against China, Iran, even DPRK, Syria, and so on. This is really, I think, the essence of a large part of the issue here. The U.S. believes that it will maintain U.S. leadership. So it's not unilateralism as isolation. It's not unilateralism as 1 versus 192, but it's the belief that the U.S. can maintain a balance of power coalition that's relatively stable, that the U.S. will pull Europe along in an anti-China pose, that the U.S. will ultimately prevail against Iran by aligning interests and so forth. I find this a dubious proposition because I start from the point that the world, most of the world, does not want a U.S.-led balance of power. Certainly some countries do, no doubt, but I don't think that there is a governing coalition that supports a U.S.-led quasi-hegemony. I believe that the U.S. role will continue to diminish over time, most fundamentally because of a falling share of global output, alternative payments to the U.S. dollar, continued climate action, and a rearrangement of alliances that will not be in the U.S. favor on the whole. Perhaps the most interesting question is Northeast Asia, and I believe that the U.S. approach of balancing with Japan and Korea on one side and China on the other is reaching not an immediate end game, but is slowly transforming into a Northeast Asian economic community where China, Japan, and Korea are more on side than adversarial. That would be, of course, a fundamental geopolitical change because China, Japan, and Korea together would constitute the largest integrated economic region and the largest technological region of the world. Ultimately, maybe it's my wishful thinking, but I believe that despite the prevailing nationalism and all of the structural uncertainties and damage from it, we are evolving towards a global regionalism where the EU will hold intact, the African Union will strengthen, Northeast Asia will coalesce, Southern Asia even will find a way forward, meaning that India will find common ground with Pakistan and Bangladesh. The Latin American countries will strengthen, and we will have a truly multipolar regionalism, but it will be undergirded by a continued globalism of basic rules. It will be multi-currency. It will not have any one hegemon, and if we're lucky, we won't blow ourselves up in the process. That last point of the strengthened regionalism in a global order is more my normative vision, perhaps, than a precise forecast, but that's where I think the world ought to go, not the direction that Trump is taking us. So these are just some opening thoughts, and I turn it back to you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you. And we'll move right now to Bob, who will continue, and then Barry Eichengreen after that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I taught Chicago MBAs for what seems like 100 years. And about 40 years ago, I began to give a quiz at the beginning of every class. These were second-year MBAs. I'd hand out a blue book, metaphorically, and I told them there are two questions. The first question is, identify the course that you had in the previous quarter or the previous year that you got the most out of. And I'd give them 30 seconds. And then I'd say, please write down the key ideas in that course. And I'd give them a couple of minutes. And then I'd turn to Jan in the first row and say, Jan, how many ideas did you write down? And there'd be a long pause, and Jan would say 2. And then I'd say, what was tuition in the course? This expensive business school, worthwhile. Jan would say $4,000 per course, and so we'd put 4,000 over 2, it's $2,000 an idea. And then, Jan, how long did you study? He'd say 10 hours a week, 10 weeks, 100 hours, over 2, 50. I've got 15 minutes for 2 ideas, right? And the first idea is one that goes back to Bob Triffin. Ned and I first met, wait for this. Ned and I first met in Bob Triffin's class in the autumn of 1956. If you do the arithmetic, that's 62 years ago. Something seems wrong in that calculation. 36, right, whatever. So Bob Triffin's main point was international consistency between or among currency areas, and that's the first point that I'm going to make. And the second point I'm going to make today is if there's an imbalance, that is, if the observed pattern of payments differs from the desired payments position, which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable. So let's go to the first idea. The first idea focuses on the change in the U.S. payments position since 1980. Now, this is part of a debate I've been having with Ned for 20 or 30 years. One of the great climacterics in Ned's view of the world occurs about 1980. Something dramatic happened about 1980 with regard to American dynamism. And 1980 is the year in which the U.S. more or less moves from having a persistent trade surplus to a persistent trade deficit. And since 1980, we've had a cumulative trade deficit of about 15,000 billion, 16,000 billion. One of the observations of President Trump is that we have lost jobs in U.S. manufacturing. And the decline in jobs in U.S. manufacturing since 1979 or 1980 is $6 or $7 billion. I misspoke. The decline in jobs in U.S. manufacturing since 1980 is 6 or 7 million people. So in 1979, 1980, we had 20 million people at work in U.S. manufacturing. Now we have 13 million people at work in U.S. manufacturing. We've also had a very significant increase in the U.S. trade deficit. So the presumption is there is a causal relationship between the increase in the U.S. trade deficit and job losses in U.S. manufacturing. And I will now take you through some basic back-of-the-envelope calculations. What is value added per worker in U.S. manufacturing? It's about $100,000 per job, $130,000 per job. If I make the assumption that the value added in U.S. manufacturing per worker is $100,000, and I have a trade deficit of $600 billion, then the arithmetic is that job losses in U.S. manufacturing are 6 million, more or less the number of jobs that we've lost. But as I've indicated, value added per worker in U.S. manufacturing is slightly larger than $100,000. So let's say it's $200,000. That would mean that the job losses in U.S. manufacturing, because of the increase in the U.S. trade deficit since 1980, are 3 million. And that's the number I'm more or less comfortable with. Indeed, if you think of the job losses tend to be at, let's call it, at those industries in which have below average value added per worker, then this increases the number of job losses because of the increase in the U.S. trade deficit. It is an enormously large number. And that's the first point that I want you to take, that the increase in the U.S. trade deficit has been associated with a massive job losses in U.S. manufacturing. And let me come now to the second point. What is the causation? Well, we heard a bit of this from Jeff. And if I heard Jeff correctly, Jeff was sort of saying that the cause of the job losses, or some of the job losses in U.S. manufacturing, is the U.S. trade deficit. Is the U.S. fiscal deficit. And that's a very popular theme. It's a theme I identify with Marty Feldstein. Some of you may remember an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in May of 2018 by Marty Feldstein and George Shultz. And it was that the trade deficit reflects the fiscal deficit, and the fiscal deficit reflects that large government expenditures. But this relationship works sort of both ways. If the cause of job losses, if the cause of the if the cause of the trade deficit were the U.S. fiscal deficit, then we might be able to identify certain countries that have larger than desired trade surpluses. I'll be prepared to take you to a free lunch, to take anyone in this room to a free lunch, if you can identify a country that believes its trade surplus is now too large. Do the Germans believe their trade surplus is too large? Or the Danes? Or the Swedes? Anyone want to take me up? I'll see you at lunch, and we can continue. We can continue the conversation. So the issue here is whether the U.S. demand for foreign savings is crowding out foreign borrowers, that is forcing them to pay a higher interest rate and is subjecting them to a smaller amount of credit than they would otherwise get, or whether instead foreign savings is crowding into the United States and displacing American saving. That's the issue. Is it crowding out or crowding in? If it's crowding out, the independent variable is America's profligacy, and the rest of the world, Germany and China, are adjusting to our shortage of savings? Or is it crowding in? That there's an excess savings in Germany, trade surplus 9% of GDP, Netherlands, trade surplus 8% of GDP, Denmark, trade surplus of 5% of GDP. These countries essentially investing in the United States because they have, they're deficient in investment opportunities at home. Now we have several ways to look at this question. One way to look at this question is to identify the currency of denomination of transactions. Has the U.S. government issued securities denominated in a foreign currency to finance the U.S. fiscal deficit? Not since 1978, and our magic year is 1980. Foreigners are buying off-the-shelf U.S. securities. They're buying readily available U.S. real assets. Let's look at this from the point of view of what happens when there is an above-average increase in the U.S. capital account surplus, that is the U.S. trade deficit. Is that associated with a very low price of the U.S. dollar, or is that associated with a very high price of the U.S. dollar? Well, when I look at the data, what I observe is that the periods when investors are buying an exceptionally large amounts of U.S. securities and the U.S. has a large trade deficit, these are periods in which the dollar is very strong. So I might take you to the late 1990s. You remember the late 1990s. This was a period when the United States actually had a fiscal surplus. First time we had 4 years of fiscal surplus. We hadn't had a run of fiscal surpluses of that magnitude since Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. So we had a modest fiscal surplus and a very, very large trade deficit. It's hardly consistent with the view that the U.S. fiscal surplus is driving the U.S. trade deficit. So periods of the strong dollar tend to be associated with above average increase in the U.S. trade deficit, and that's because investors love U.S. dollar securities. And the third point that I would mention in this regard is the identity of the foreigners who have acquired 15,000 billion of the U.S. securities and real assets. And here there's a problem of non-congruent sets. But during this period, sovereign wealth funds, the Norwegian sovereign wealth funds, the United Arab Emirates sovereign wealth funds, etc., these sovereign wealth funds have acquired 8,000 billion of U.S. of savings, of net foreign assets. Hard to believe that any of these have done so to finance the U.S. fiscal deficit. What they have been doing is essentially taking a view of how do we optimize the value of our wealth? How much should we produce and how much should we consume? And the rest is used to buy foreign assets, and many of those foreign assets are the Americans. If we look at this, look at the acquisitions of U.S. dollar securities, by foreign central banks. Is about 6,000 billion since 1980. And these foreign central banks have been buying US dollar securities, like the Chinese, to prevent an increase in the price of their currencies, or that is, to maintain an overvalued US dollar. So let me come to these two main points that I want to leave you with. The second is that there is a strong relationship between the job losses in US manufacturing and the US trade deficit. And my ballpark estimate is that we've lost 3 million jobs in US manufacturing since 1980 because of the increase in the US trade deficit. The second point I want to leave you with is that one of the important independent variables is excess savings in foreign countries, that the United States has taken a very benign view toward the price of the US dollar and toward foreign acquisitions of US assets. And that benign view has been extraordinarily costly in terms of job losses in US manufacturing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. I frankly can't recall being on a panel where somebody offered a free lunch to a large audience.
To anyone in the large audience.
Okay, firmly held belief, indeed. All right, we'll move on to Barry. Thank you.
I should start by observing that, like Ned and Bob, Robert Griffin was my teacher as well, although I took his course somewhat later. The stated topic of this session is Trump's trade policies, so I'm going to pull a fast one and talk about Trump's trade policies. Where to start? I think we should start by asking what Mr. Trump's trade policies are designed to achieve, and given that, whether they are fit for purpose, let me list 6 of the stated objectives. Number 1, to enhance U.S. national security. Will they enhance U.S. national security? Answering that question requires asking some ancillary questions. Does Canada pose a threat to U.S. national security? Does taxing steel and aluminum imports from Canada enhance U.S. national security? Will taxing motor vehicle imports from Europe or South Korea enhance U.S. national security? I'm not going to bother answering these questions because I think they answer themselves. Second objective, to extract useful concessions in negotiations with our NAFTA partners. On the whole, it hasn't worked out that way. Our taxes on Canadian steel and aluminum have so angered our Canadian friends that those negotiations have come more difficult, and I think the cosmetic concessions that have been extracted from Mexico are of the strongly welfare-reducing type from the U.S. perspective. Objective number 3, strengthen the trade and current account balance. So here I think we've heard a little bit of a disagreement between the two previous speakers. In my view, tariffs obviously have had and will have no such effect. The current account of the balance of payments is determined by savings and investment, neither of which will be much affected by tariffs. Insofar as those tariffs are applied selectively, they will simply divert imports into the United States from some source countries to others. If they're applied uniformly, they will simply be offset to a first approximation by proportional strengthening of the dollar exchange rate, a point that another Columbia professor, Robert Mundell, made about 60 years ago. Objective number 4, render U.S. manufacturing more competitive. In fact, the majority of tariffs to date have been levied on intermediate inputs into manufacturing and on capital equipment. And this is again true of 3/4 of the $200 billion worth of tariffs on imports from China that the Trump administration is now purportedly proposing to announce later this week. These are all inputs into production. Taxes on them render U.S. manufacturing less competitive. It's been widely observed that for every steel and aluminum job created by the United States as a result of the Trump administration's tariffs, multiple downstream jobs are lost. And that's precisely the point. That's what you expect if you were taxing inputs into the domestic manufacturing process. Objective number 5, accelerate the long-term growth of the U.S. economy. Trump's tariffs have the effect of shifting resources into old-line manufacturing, things like steel and aluminum, and away from high-tech activities that make use of artificial intelligence, robotics, biotech, take your pick. Which of these broad segments of the economy, in your view, have the greater potential for productivity growth? And finally, objective number 6, create more good jobs for hardworking Americans in manufacturing. The evidence, and here I strongly disagree with what Bob said a moment ago, the empirical evidence on the decline in manufacturing employment in the United States is that the majority of the decline that we have seen in the last 2, 3, 4 decades has been due to technological change, skilled labor using and unskilled labor saving technical change, mechanization, and not import competition. It follows that stifling import competition won't bring back those jobs. It will not turn back the progress of skill-biased technological change. Trump's tariffs will be good for American robots, not for American workers. So what's the common explanation for these 6 policy failures? One answer is simple economic illiteracy. In some respects, this illiteracy takes the form of a failure to understand basic economic logic. In other respects, it reflects a failure to understand how the U.S. economy has been changing. The structure of the economy has been changing to where the vast majority of employment, high productivity employment with high productivity growth potential is in services, in sectors that supply healthcare services, business services, personal services, and the like. The sectors with the greatest potential for productivity growth are high-tech services, not old-line manufacturing. Moreover, today, to the extent that manufacturing has high value added and has the potential for higher value added, that is associated with global supply chains, which are critical to its competitiveness. And we see evidence of this in the opposition to Trump's tariffs from even the U.S. motor vehicle producers, who source parts and components not only throughout North America, but globally. But Trump continues to measure productivity, competitiveness, economic prowess by number of cars produced and tons of steel rolled. But I also think there has been another source of this policy failure, this one for which economists, mainstream economists, are partly to blame. To put it very simply, too many economists forgot the Stoper-Samuelson theorem, or so it would appear. As a profession, we did too little to emphasize that globalization doesn't automatically raise all boats. There are losers as well as winners from openness and international competition. And partly as a result of that, public policy did too little, it continues to do little to compensate the losers by giving them the education and training they need for productive employment in the 21st century, by providing them with relocation allowances, by pursuing place-based policies, by supplementing economic openness with an equitable tax system. In my latest book, everybody as a comment along those lines, I argue that there are deep-seated reasons rooted in American history why the United States is singularly unsuccessful, indeed unwilling, to provide these kind of basic public goods, reasons rooted in the country's historic racial divide and in the deep and abiding suspicion of federal government bequeathed by that divide, but that's a different story. Finally, let me speak to the one valid concern raised by Trump's trade strategists, which concerns China's treatment of foreign intellectual property. I'm not talking here about China 2025, which I think has been mentioned. I think Glenn Hubbard mentioned it earlier, which is China's industrial policy cum development strategy, in which it's seeking to position itself as a leader in a variety of high-tech sectors. Governments are entitled to pursue industrial policies. Governments are entitled to have development strategies. All countries have industrial policies and development strategies of one sort or another, some more successful than others. The question is whether those policies and strategies discriminate against US firms and do so in damaging ways. Here I do think that there is a solid argument that requiring US firms wishing to invest and produce in China as a condition of doing so to enter into joint venture agreements with Chinese partners in which the US firm is required to share its proprietary technology and to give up its intellectual property after 10 years is seriously damaging. The US firm can opt to stay out of China, of course, but it then loses access to the Chinese market, given China's own tariffs, and it loses access to China's talented labor force. I see no reason why Chinese firms shouldn't be permitted to license US technologies on market terms. I see no reason why Chinese firms shouldn't be permitted to, shouldn't be encouraged to develop their own competing technologies. The Chinese government can use tax policies and even subsidies to encourage these practices subject to World Trade Organization rules, but forced technology transfer through joint ventures is, I think, another story. The question, though, is what should the United States do about these practices? It's clear that tariffs are, at best, an oblique and ineffective way of pressuring China to change these practices. Better, I think, would be to consider one or several of the following options. Number one, negotiate a bilateral investment treaty with China that sets out clearly what is acceptable practice and what is unacceptable practice. And you will recall, I hope, that the Obama administration was attempting to negotiate just such a treaty but ran out of time in 2016. Number two, obtain remedies through the WTO rules that are embedded in the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS. TRIPS forbids discrimination in the application of intellectual property protection, but that requires the United States to remain a committed, supportive member of the World Trade Organization. Enough said. And third, join together with other countries in pursuing these remedies, since forming a coalition of the willing will make it that much more difficult and costly for China not to concede. Again, this, you will recall, was precisely what the Obama administration was trying to do by negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the one thing these approaches have in common is that they have a greater probability of succeeding if the US works together in its trade policy, trade and intellectual property policy initiatives, if it works together with other countries. And that, of course, is precisely the opposite of the approach taken by the Trump administration.
Thank you, Barry. And we have a few minutes for questions, so why don't we take a round of questions for the participants. Please wait for the microphone.
Hi, thank you very much. This is for Professor Sachs. So one impact of America First that you mentioned was the dollar's role will be diminished. The recent turmoil in emerging markets has kind of reaffirmed how dominant the dollar is. And on many measures, the internationalization of China's currency has stalled. So how do you see this multipolar currency system taking shape given these dynamics?
Okay. Do we have other questions? Maybe we'll collect a couple. Right here, Rob.
Thank you. I just don't think we can leave this unresolved whether the job losses are due. I don't think we can leave this unresolved or the job losses due to trade deficit or to technological change. So I'm just hoping that Bob and Barry could go at it for a couple of minutes and see where we can get to.
There is empirical evidence, so we should be able to go somewhere. Okay, we have one in the back.
Professor Eichengreen, you talked about the need to have better programs to retrain workers and so on, and I think we all would agree with that, but is that really a sufficient solution to the loss of manufacturing jobs? Should we be thinking more broadly? I mean, should factories have the right to just pick up and leave where they've been in communities, they've had tax subsidies, all kinds of underlying supports from communities, from cities and states? And I don't know, should we be thinking more radically or probe more deeply about ways of dealing with the loss of manufacturing than purely retraining? Should we, I mean, China has much more of a policy where factories are prevented from just shutting down because of what happens with workers. I don't know if that's ideal, but should we think more about broader type of solutions?
And we have one more right up front here, second row. Then we'll turn it over to the speakers.
Yes, it's a question to Eichengreen. Thanks for bringing up this story about the IP there. So when it comes to the WTO rules, TRIPS and so on, are you suggesting that the question is rather following the treaty or developing a new treaty adding on to the TRIPS? For the example you gave, discrimination is already in the Paris Convention, which is 1883. That's nothing new with TRIPS. And if you can, elaborate a little bit more on what you mean with the costly not to concede here, what you envisage in that point, the third point you made. But primarily, is it following the treaty you're asking, or is it a requirement of some new rules of treaties you think is necessary to make this licensing possible?
All right, Jeff, if you're there, maybe we'll turn to you first.
Good. Thank you very much. Let me say a word about this question of trade and jobs first. I think, without question, it's both. The opening of China, NAFTA, definitely caused U.S. multinationals to shift operations to both countries, both in direct investments abroad and also in offshoring. Bob suggested a number of 3 million jobs out of the 6 to 7 million lost, so something like half or a little bit less than half. One could quibble that it's 2 million. I think that the idea that the decline of jobs is both a reflection of technological advancement and offshoring is absolutely correct. But I want to remind all of us about some simple accounting. Offshoring does not per se lead to a current account deficit. It leads to a trade deficit balanced by a capital account surplus, the profits earned on the overseas operation. And indeed, there's no reason why it leads at all to an overall imbalance in the net savings investment balance, because you have a compensating income flow, nor does it diminish U.S. output. It raises U.S. output. It is a good thing, but it redistributes income. And America lost the language of basic redistribution of income. That's also what Barry was referring to with the Stoper-Samuelson theorem. Offshoring reduces industrial wages. Workers find jobs elsewhere. We still have high employment, but at lower wages. This is true. It's not the only phenomenon underway because technological change is also skill biased. That's another part of what's happening. But the main point is the national income rises with trade, even overseas investment, it rises. But it rises for capital income, not for workers' income. Trade adjustment assistance is not sufficient. You need a much more socially balanced policy that taxes the rich and helps to cushion the poor through provision of public services, through direct assistance mechanisms, and so on. It's called social democracy. We lost that language in the United States. So to the extent that Trump is catering to votes in the Midwest, it is a fourth best policy. It would shrink the U.S. economy to help sustain some measure of income distribution that would be much better supported by having open trade, open investment, and a tax and transfer system, or I should say a tax transfer and public services system that would make sure that as national income rises, all parts of the U.S. economy rise together with it. Completely possible. We just don't do it. So we have left the industrial workers behind. But it is not the case that the overall balance of payments has sustained a deficit because of this. We have a large, very large net profitability of overseas investments. It has risen since 1980. It is the counterpart of the jobs overseas to the extent that those occur. It's also the case that even if 2 or 3 million workers are providing offshore jobs for the U.S., if you were to try to repatriate those would turn into a very tiny fraction of jobs back in the U.S. because we would use a lot more capital-intensive production processes.
Jeff,
that's what
we'll
saying.
Have to conclude. So
that was what Barry was saying with the robots. So I think that this is key. We don't have a fair system. We lost the language of redistribution. If you do trade without redistribution, you do not balance the society. Finally, on the role of the dollar, it is not the case that the internationalization of the renminbi is slowed, and the internationalization of the euro will also increase. So we will see 3 currencies with 3 payment systems, partly overlapping, but if the U.S. pushes too hard, they will have their own separate payment systems outside of SWIFT, for example, that enable euro clearing or renminbi clearing despite U.S. attempts at sanctions. We're just in the middle of that transitional process, but it's a 10 to 20 year process, no doubt.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. I'll turn to Bob.
I'll just ask a question. Is the United States better off with a trade balance of 0 or with a trade deficit of $600 billion? That's a simple question.
Okay, that's a good food for thought. Barry?
3 quick points. First one to agree with Jeff about the consequences of the Trump administration weaponizing the dollar. History provides an example when there was a big geopolitical shock and institutional innovation in financial markets. The shock was World War I. That disrupted existing payment systems. The institutional innovation was the Federal Reserve Act, which provided a liquidity provider of last resort and enabled U.S. banks to branch abroad for the first time. And the result was a shift from sterling preeminence to dollar preeminence in less than a decade. If I was going to take bets this time, I would bet on the euro, that they are halfway down that institutional path, and they are unhappy about how the administration threatens to use access to the US banking system and the dollar against European companies that fail to adhere to unilaterally reimposed US sanctions on Iran. On trading technology, of course it is both, but my reading of the scholarly literature, which I review at length in my book, is that it's predominantly technology. And one bit of evidence of that is that the decline in manufacturing and employment in the United States long predates China's emergence on the global scene, or hyper globalization more generally. It goes back to the 1960s and 1970s. Finally, on what should we do about manufacturing employment in those factories. So here I'm happy to go out on a limb. There is nothing special about manufacturing. There is nothing special about factories. We should care about good jobs. We shouldn't care about manufacturing or factories. We have a good job problem in the manufacturing sector associated with, among other things, the decline of unionization, but we have a good job problem in the service sector with the gig economy as well. So the proper question is, what can we do there? There are ideas in the air like co-determination, which are underdeveloped and disputed, but Senator Warren has put this idea in the air. Other people point to the desirability of expanding the earned income tax credit that Glenn mentioned this morning. If it's hard to pay people a living wage in certain service activities, wage subsidies are a way to get people into gainful employment where they acquire the experience to become even more productive and well remunerated workers over time.
All right, let me thank all the participants, and we will now go to lunch. Is that correct? Okay, there is a reward.